previously. 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project went to Turin, Italy. They had 120 hours to examine this very enigmatic artifact known as the Shroud. I'm a Shroudie. I believe it's the real deal. I call it God's calling card. Mr. Schwortz over here stayed up for over 100 hours out of that 120, continually taking photographs. His photographs are absolutely phenomenal. They are all over the internet, many of them illegally, by the way. He continues to talk about the Shroud. He is an absolute wellspring of knowledge when it comes to this artifact. You are in for a treat. I'll shut up, turn it right over. Barrie, welcome.
Thanks, brother. Wow. I certainly hope that I can live up to all that. Well, I'm going to start my lecture the way I always do, because it's very important that you, right from the get-go, you know a little bit about me. So I'm going to tell you that before I'm finished, God willing, in enough time, you'll know better what a nice Jewish boy like me is doing involved with what is quite possibly the most important relic of Christianity. And right off the bat, I know that some people might have their eyebrows go up when I say that. So it's important for you to know, and by the way, I don't want to make you sad, but I'm not a Messianic Jew, okay? So just let's set the record straight right from the beginning. I'm just an old hippie Jewish photographer, basically. Anyway, now normally when I start to talk, the first thing people always ask me is how I got involved with the Shroud, and I want to tell you that. But over the years, I have spoken to many groups like this, of many different denominations, and I've learned over the years that Protestants and evangelicals view the Shroud a little differently than obviously some other denominations and obviously Catholics. So last night at about 3 in the morning, I thought, because I've had the opportunity over 2 days to speak to many of you and to hear your points of view from an evangelical point of view on the Shroud, and it occurred to me that I needed to address a few issues before I get into the real part of the lecture. So this is added. This is not normal. This is specifically because I'm speaking to you. And I call it the top 4 reasons why some Christians are Shroud skeptics. Because as a Jew who spent so many years of my life involved with this piece of cloth, to me it just boggles my mind that the biggest skeptics are all Christians. You would think that Jews or people of other faiths or atheists or something like that might be the big skeptics. And yet over the years I've found that it's Christians themselves who have great doubts about the Shroud. So what I've done is I've written these 4 points down. I want to go through them quickly because I want to get to the pretty picture part of the show, which is more entertaining. Okay, the first reason why some Christians find the Shroud doubtful is they consider it's a graven image. Now, I'm Jewish. Jews know about graven images. We had a golden calf, cost us about 40 years in the desert. Okay? So we have some sense of what a graven image is. And a graven image effectively is man's depiction of God. Jews are still forbidden to do it. Muslims are forbidden to do it. And until the Orthodox Church began the iconography, even Christians didn't do it. Depict, God or have depictions of God. So is the Shroud a graven image? Well, by the definition that I just gave you, that it's a man-made depiction of God, our team, headed by Dr. John Jackson, who's sitting right out there, by the way, he's going to participate in the Q&A with his wonderful wife, Rebecca, afterwards. Our team went to Turin to figure out how this image was made. And what we were able to do, and I'm going to use the word that I rarely use, prove, we proved, underline, bold, the Shroud is not a painting, it's not a photograph, it's not a scorch, it's not a rubbing, it is not made by the hand of a man, but the image formed by some interaction between the cloth and the body. And guess what? That eliminates any possibility of it being a graven image. That eliminates that, because a graven image would be an artwork. Okay? Really? Okay. Okay, now we're going to get to a more sensitive subject relevant to that same graven image. The other thing that many Christians tell me, well, that's a Catholic thing. See, I can say that. I'm a Jew, so I'm already in trouble here. I'm the token Jew. Well, actually, the real token Jew is there, and I'm the second one, okay? But it is, What most people don't know is everybody thinks it's been owned by the Catholic Church forever, huh? Wrong. 1985 is when it came into the possession of the Catholic Church legally, and it's not the institution of the church that owns it. It is the Holy See, the living Pope. When Pope Benedict retired and resigned, the new Pope, Pope Francis, became the legal owner of the shroud. It's been legally in the hands of the Catholic Church since 1985, and before that it was owned by the Savoy family for over 500 years, the ruling monarchy of Italy. Okay? So it's not a Catholic thing. And, you know, when you have something that verifies everything the Gospels tell us about what was done to Jesus, like a forensic crime scene in complete 100% scientific accuracy, folks, this is the real deal, and I'll show you why in a while. Okay, the other thing I hear from people is it said in the Gospels that there were 2 cloths, and the shroud is only one, so it can't be real. I don't know why people don't understand that, yes, there were 2 cloths, but over 2,000 years, there is the possibility they might have gotten separated. You know? Remember that the shroud violates 2 Jewish laws right from the beginning. It's got blood on it. It's supposed to stay in the tomb. Same with the second cloth, the face cloth. And by the way, to be clear, when they took him off the cross, they put this face cloth on him, and they took him to the tomb, and they removed the face cloth. There's no image on it, just blood and other fluids. Okay? And so that was kept in the tomb, like it says in the Gospels. Separate, folded separate from the other. But there, because Jewish law required it be buried with the body. Okay? So where did these linen strips come in? Well, you'll see in a bit, I'm going to show you how the cloth was wrapped around the body. You'll see that if you tried to move the body with the cloth wrapped around it that way, it would fall off. So they would use linen strips to bind the body within the shroud. The Jewish burials were not done like the Egyptian mummies, okay? So that is incorrect. And Rebecca's here, and you can ask her in the Q&A for more detailed information about Jewish burials, because she's very much an authority on that. So, there were 2 cloths, both mentioned in the Gospels. Both exist. The second cloth, the face cloth, is in Oviedo, Spain, documented back to the 6th century. Okay, then we get to the other thing that bothers people, long hair. Somebody said to me, it says in the Gospels that long hair is a bad thing. Yeah, what Gospel does it say that in? Don't ask me, I'm not an expert. But it says it in a part of the Gospel that was written somewhere between 30 and 50 years after Jesus died. Okay? I think it was a letter from Paul, if I'm not mistaken, that talks about hair length. The Essenes all had long hair. All the Old Testament prophets had long hair. And so what if Jesus had long hair? That rule, and it wasn't really a rule, but that statement was made long after Jesus died, so the long hair doesn't apply to him. He was a Jew. He was not a Christian. So he followed Jewish law, and it was okay to have long hair. The other thing is the beard. Now, I just happen to have one of those too. And they talk about a plucked beard, and I've had people say to me, well, it says in the Gospels they plucked his beard, and this man's got a beard. It's got to be a fake. And my answer is, it didn't say they gave him a shave. It said they plucked his beard. Look at the image of the man in the shroud, and you'll see there's a V pulled out of the beard. Now, I happen to have one, and you know, when I zip up my big jacket in the wintertime and I catch one little hair in that zipper, I get tears in my eyes. It's so painful for one hair to get pulled. Imagine ripping a chunk of somebody's beard out, adding to the pain and humiliation. But that does not disqualify the Shroud of Turin as being what it is. Okay? So those are the things that bother Christians, some Christians, a lot. And all of those are easily explained. Hopefully I've done a decent job of explaining to you why those aren't really relevant to the shroud. Now, with that in mind, that's the new part that I added for you guys. Now I'm going to go back to the regular presentation, and we're going to talk a little bit about the shroud. I'll just put it up here for you to look at. Now, the real question I get all the time is, how'd you get involved with this? And boy, you know, I asked myself that a lot of times over the years, in the early days especially. So here's what happened. I am a professional photographer, and I was pretty good technically, and I was contracted by a company that was a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratories back in 1976. And we did a 7-month project where I was a photographic consultant to Los Alamos, and of course you know what Los Alamos is, so you can imagine that the subject matter of our project was atomic bombs, because that's what Los Alamos is famous for, and that's kind of what they do. Well, I'd love to tell you more about that, but then I'd have to kill you all, so we'll just leave it at that. At the end of that 7 months, I finished, and the gentleman I'd worked with, Don DeVan, I don't know, a few weeks later, called me up again. He said, "Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I laughed. I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And Don laughed and he said, "So am I, remember?" Because Don was one of the other Jewish guys on our team. And he explained to me that John Jackson and Eric Jumper and Ken Stevenson and Don DeVan and Bill Modern all got together over at Sandia Laboratories, and they put an image of the Shroud of Turin into a device called a VP8 image analyzer, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And they determined that there's information encoded into the shroud image that's effectively distance information, depth information, or topographical information. And that was enough to give John, who was born and raised in the Catholic faith, enough impetus to say, you know, we should put a team together and we should see if we can get permission and go there and try and figure out how this image got on the cloth that has a property like no photograph or artwork could have. And so that moment became the catalyst for the creation of the STIRP team, which John was the founder of, and then Eric Jumper came along and others. So when Don DeVan asked me that question, he said, "So, do you want to be on this team?" I said, no. No. Because I was uncomfortable. I said, I don't want to get involved with this. This doesn't represent my beliefs. But I was really fascinated by that image property because he was an imaging guy, Don DeVan, and he was able to explain it to me in terms that I grasped, so it made me curious. So I said, well, okay, I guess I will. And he said, well, look, let me bring you some literature so you can look at it and you can read what we know about the shroud, and then maybe that'll help you to decide. So he brings me a bunch of literature, mostly from an organization called the Holy Shroud Guild, a Catholic organization. They were all religious tracts, primarily. And there was no scientific data about the shroud. And that didn't help a bit. Matter of fact, that might have hurt. Because I thought, see, that's just what I thought. This is all about religion, and that's not my deal. But I said, well, all right, maybe I'll stay on the team and just for a little while. And a few months into it, as the team grew, we had a couple of guys added to the team from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Don Lynn and Jean Lohr, may they both rest in peace, now gone. Don Lynn was imaging project manager on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo. You might have heard of some of those. And he was my hero. I mean, this is a NASA imaging scientist, and I'm a photographer, technical photographer. That's as good as it gets. So I was pretty excited, and I was ecstatic to be around him. And I remember saying to Don one day, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team?" And Don looked at me and he said, "Well, apparently you've forgotten that the man in question's a Jew." And I said, "No, that's about all I know about him, but no, I knew that." And he said, "Oh, so you don't think God wants one of his chosen people on our team?" And then I laughed because I never thought that. And then Don gave me what, in retrospect, may well be some of the best advice I've ever been given. He said, "Barrie, go to Turin. Do the very best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." And on those words, I stayed on the team. And that moment, I believe, is when God, speaking through my friend Don's lips, told me, "Go do this, because I got a plan for you." And he did. And I stayed on the team. And it only took another 17 years after we finished our work before I became convinced the shroud was authentic, so I didn't rush. Not even close. But I did. So what I'm going to do today, because time is short and I talk a lot, you know, it's easy to get me started, hard to get me stopped. I always point out what my initials are. See, it always takes a second. But you see, I can even tell that joke in a church with a bishop sitting there, and even the bishop laughed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the shroud. I'm going to take you behind the scenes of what we did in 1978. This is not going to be a hardcore science lecture on the shroud. This is going to be a quick overview. And look, I want to keep you awake and entertain you a little, so I want you to see what this group of men did They spent 18 or 19 months in advance of going to Italy, planning every detail and planning for every possible problem that might come up. I want you to see how thorough and professional this team was. Okay? And when you see that, I think you'll be pretty blown away at what we had to deal with once we got there. Not the expected thing that, you would expect, a white, nice laboratory with beautiful tables and no. We're in a 400-year-old, dusty, creaky, dirty old palace. So I'm going to take you behind the scenes and show you all that, and then at the end, after I'm finished with that, I'm going to share with you the impact that this involvement with the shroud has had on my life, because I think that's really something that you want to know and I want to share with you. So with that in mind, let's... Is there any possibility of bringing the lights on me down? Because they don't need to see me anymore. They've seen enough of me. What's really going to be important is what's on the screens out there. and maybe not. Oh, they're videotaping, so I guess that's good if they can bring it down a little. Mainly so you can see the screen. How's it looking up there? Oh, it's looking fine. All right, so what do we have? We have this piece of linen cloth. It's about 14.5 by 3.5 feet. Kind of odd dimensions. And Rebecca can answer this a little better later on. But if you convert that to the unit of measure used in the first century, which are called cubits, it's exactly some... John, do you remember how many cubits by how many? 2 by 8. Okay? So that's a first century unit of measure. And this is precisely that. But it's kind of weird by modern American standards, because we still are using inches here anyway. I go to Europe a lot and they just laugh at us. Well, I told them we went on the metric system 35 years ago, and at least 7 of us have learned it by now. Maybe 8, I don't know. Anyway, so there's the piece of cloth that's in question. Now, this you've seen, and how many of you heard Russ speak yesterday, Russ Burrell? So a lot of what Russ covered, instead of repeating it, I'm going to zip through that so it gives me a little more time for the other stuff. But this indicates, this is a painting by Della Rovere, and it illustrates how a cloth would have been wrapped around the body to create a head-to-head image like we have on the shroud. And you can see on the bottom image that if you were to leave the body like that and tried to move the body, the cloth would just come off. So the linen strips were there just to bind him in. When my father died 10 years ago, he had an Orthodox Jewish burial, plain wooden coffin, no embalming. And he was put in a linen shroud, a white linen shroud. The only difference it was sewn along the side. So there was no need for linen strips anymore, because it was like a mummy bag, sort of, and he was sort of slid into it. And so that's very consistent with first century Jewish burial. Now, the shroud was little known outside of northern Italy until 1898, when this gentleman, using that little camera, was able to make the first photograph of the shroud, ushering in what really was the beginning of the scientific era of the shroud, where science could take note of it. Because before that, unless you traveled to northern Italy, to Turin, on one of the few years, every 4 times or so every century, they would bring it out for public viewing. Otherwise, you can't see it when you go there. So what this allowed was, these photographs allowed it to be reproduced in books and other publications, so that people outside of northern Italy could finally begin to see this object. And that, of course, began to attract curiosity, and ultimately researchers and medical folks who wanted to examine it from their perspective. So Secondo Pia ushered in the scientific era of the shroud. Now, when he photographed it, that's what he looked at with his eyes, what you see up on the screen there. But he was using a big old black and white negative camera, so what his film saw was this. And what Secondo Pia said in something he wrote, he had a close-up he had made of the face of the man of the shroud, and he processed that glass plate at night. In the morning, he opened the shutters up and he held it up. It was a close-up of the face, and he said he almost dropped it. He was looking into the face of the Lord. That's what he said. And so it had great impact on Secondo Pia. But Secondo Pia also noticed something else, that the image on the shroud looked a whole lot better on his negative than it did to the eye. And he realized that his negative plate was in fact a positive, meaning the image on the shroud has a property like a photographic negative. The lights and darks are reversed. You think some medieval forger could have done that? the first thing he would have had to do was invent photography. 500 years before it really was invented. You know, the official beginning of photography is 1818. Nietzsche von Nipsche made a photograph of his garden, and they still have the glass plate at the Smithsonian, okay? Or somewhere. So the point is, photography is an industrial revolution invention, and nobody in medieval times could have conceived of this, let alone produced this, okay? So that's important just as a point of view. But it's very hard, and I see you turning your head. So let's make it easy. Let's put the shrouds side by side. Now, some of you have already seen the little booklet we have, and this basically, what I'm going to show you now is the same thing as the little booklet. It kind of calls out some of the prominent features that are on the shroud. And because Russ has done this twice yesterday, and many of you have seen that, I'm going to kind of go through these rather quickly. Those burns and scorches down the side of the image, if you see on the left those brown marks, those scorches, burns are kind of odd shapes, and they run down either side of the ventral image. Actually, they run the full length of the shroud. Those triangular things there are patches that were sewn in. Fire occurred in 1532, 1534. The poor Clare nuns fixed it, repaired it, sewed in patches, and to strengthen the whole cloth, because it had been weakened by the fire, they sewed a backing sheet onto it that was called the Holland cloth. Okay? And that gave it more strength. And so those marks make looking at the shroud very confusing to the uninitiated eye. Of course, it's a little easier on the right image there because the man sort of stands out from the background. That's a contrast-enhanced negative view. So you can see all these things that are on the shroud, and ironically, you know, if you read the New Testament, we have 4 different accounts of what was done to Jesus, slight variations amongst them, but generally agreeing on all the major things. Everything on the shroud, or in the Gospels, is documented precisely on the shroud with forensic accuracy. Now, I was debating a well-known skeptic, I won't mention Joe Nichols' name. Well, he's an atheist, so I can mention his name. What's he going to do? He doesn't want to debate with me anymore because I know the science better than he does, and he can't accuse me of having a Christian bias, which is his normal attack. So anyway, Joe and I were having this debate, and he said, you know, Barrie, the shroud is just too perfect, it can't be real. So I said, oh, well then if it were less perfect, Joe, then you'd accept it's authentic. And he said, of course not, which told me something. But once people have made up their minds, doesn't matter what evidence you present, doesn't matter. They've already decided. You know, I was in Vancouver, and a guy came up to me after my lecture, and he said, oh, Mr. Schwortz, that was a great lecture. He says, you know, but you'll never convince me. And I looked him right in the eye and said, what makes you think I care what you believe? And he gave me one of these wide-eyed, wide-mouthed, whoa. I said, you know, that's really between you and God. You should take it up with him. And that's the end of it. So I don't waste time messing with these folks. The facts are the facts, and my job is not to convince anybody of anything. I'm a Jew. I'm standing in front of a group of evangelicals. I'm supposed to tell you something about the Gospels? That doesn't make any sense. No, but I can tell you what I've learned because I've had to learn this because I do this, and I want to give people the truth. My job is easy. God said to me, you will tell people the truth about this piece of cloth. He didn't say go out and make up any story you can to convince people, because I would have failed at that miserably. But telling the truth is easy because my mother taught me the truth at the end of a leather belt at age 5, so I learned it pretty quick. Well, she was from Poland, you know, the old country. That's how they did it in those days. Now they'd probably arrest her, but you know, it did impress upon me the importance of the truth. Let's look at the other half, and it's easier to have the man standing in front of you like this. And like I said, Russ has covered this. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of it. But everything that it tells us in the Gospels that was done to Jesus is here. You've got the spear wound. You've got the scourge marks, not only on the back, but also on the front of the body. You've got the blood flow from the spear wound actually pooling around to the back of the man. You can see that below the patches on the right side very easily, that white area, or that blood going across there, those blood stains. That's water or blood that's pulled around from the spear wound. What, some medieval forger would think of gravity and how that worked and how it would work? I mean, that's just nonsensical to think somebody did that. One of the things you do notice is there's a full footprint on the right side, you can see it would be the left foot on the right image there. That tells us something that if you lay on your back, you know, you can't put your foot flat without bending your knees. So we know that knee is bent for sure, because that's the only human way that you can get your foot flat. And you can see an entire footprint there. So continuing on, now these are the scourge marks. You know, there's a lot of debate in the shroud world as to whether or not this man's body was washed. Because in the Gospels it tells us there was not time for a proper preparation of the body. They were going to do that Sunday. And there's a debate raging within the shroud pro-authenticity folks as to whether or not this is the case. Some people believe he was, some people believe he wasn't. We did learn through our research that the blood inhibits the image formation mechanism, and if this man were covered from head to toe with blood, as he may well have been at some point in time, if they hadn't washed him, we might not even see an image on the shroud. At least that's my opinion. But that doesn't mean everybody agrees to that. And one has to be aware of the fact that in the world of the shroud, it's a good thing agreement isn't necessary for friendship, or none of us would have any friends. Because even in the pro-authenticity side, there's debates raging constantly about various finer points of the shroud. But within that large group, there is no debate as to the veracity and the authenticity of the cloth. So, you know, you get the forensic guys arguing with each other over forensic details, physicists over physics details, imaging guys over imaging details. So this is natural. But look, science evolves and moves forward by disagreement. If everybody always agreed about everything, we'd still be living in caves. The fact that somebody said, you know, we could do better than this. Somebody disagreed and found a way to make it better. So disagreement is essential to the scientific method, if you will. But obviously, it's nice when we can find points to agree on. And I'd say the majority of the shroud world does agree on the really important stuff, like this is Jesus. So there's the scourge marks. By the way, this is what a flagrum looks like. This is the typical whip that a Roman soldier would have used and applied to the body of Jesus. And there's a close-up of one of the couple of the scourge marks, and you can see these dumbbell-shaped weights on the end of the flagrum are consistent with the blood stains and scourge marks that are on the back side of, on the body of the man of the shroud, approximately 120 of them. Aha! Remember the VP8 image analyzer? I mentioned that to you before. That's that device that John and the other gentleman. And by the way, I want to clarify something in case you've heard it, that this VP8 was used by NASA to map the moon and the Mars. This particular device was at Sandia Laboratories, a sister laboratory to Los Alamos, also a weapons and explosives laboratory. And Bill Modern was using this to evaluate some X-rays that he had. It had nothing to do with mapping the moon or Mars. But somehow that got written up, and now that's become part of the shroud mythology. But to my knowledge, NASA never used this device, even though that's what's often reported. And for those of us in the room that are over 40, that looks like an old stereo tuner. For those of you under 40, that's a really big iPad or iPod. Okay, that's the only way I can describe that. Well, it's really funny because I was lecturing to a young group one day, and I was talking about film and our cameras. And a kid put up his hand, had to be about 10 years old, and he goes, "Film, is that USB?" And I thought, oh boy, I really am getting old. And I feel really bad for Paul Simon. His song Kodachrome is going to be meaningless in a few more years. Nobody's going to even know what that means, because Kodak discontinued it 4 years ago. Anyway, this is the device itself. And this is one of my photographs, but typical of the photographs that were put into this device. The input to the device was very simple. It was just a monochrome, black and white video camera. And the input was a photograph input, and the output was on a green screen raster display monitor, sort of an oscilloscope type of display. And it allowed you to turn up and down the gain of the image. And what the VP8 does is that it takes the lights and darks of the image and stretches them vertically based on density, effectively. Okay? And so if you put a normal photograph into a VP8, well, you get kind of a distorted, nonsensical looking thing. But you put the shroud image in, you get the natural relief of a human form. That's the characteristic of the shroud that Don DeVan explained to me. He said, "Barrie, there's..." and I'm going to use technical terms for a moment, hopefully not to confuse you. He said there's a correlation between image density and cloth body distance. In other words, the closer the cloth was to the body where it was touching, for example, the image is most dark or dense. And as the distance increases, the image grows more faint proportionately, up to about 4 centimeters where it reaches extinction. So it's not really 3D. It's often called 3D. It's actually 4 centimeters depth on either side. It's topographic information. But if I had to do this and somebody plopped $1 million cash on this table, I wouldn't have a clue how to do that and create an image with those properties. I told you that normal photographs don't yield the same result. And when I was photographing, this is, by the way, this is real video footage shot off the screen of a real VP8. My friend Kevin Moran in Charlotte, North Carolina, allowed me to come down and keep him up all night one night while I made these videos. And I said, you know, Kevin, I'm going to tell my audiences that normal photographs do not have this same property as the shroud, so I need a normal photograph. And I grabbed a picture of his grandkids off the wall, and I put it in the VP8, and here's the result. So let's look at the little boy on the left. Now look at his hair. And the best one to look at might perhaps be the bottom one. You can see that's being rotated. Look at the hair. His hair's going down into his head. Look at his nose and mouth. They're all at the same plane. They're all flat. His mouth, boy, his mouth looks like he's been to a really bad dentist. I don't know what to say. And the little kid on the right, well, you know, what can I possibly say about that? But as you can see, there's no natural proportion. The nose, the cheeks, the mouth are all sort of flattened or pushed in where they shouldn't be. It is not the natural relief of a human form. Normal photographs do not encode spatial or topographical information. So this is sort of the key principle or property of the shroud itself that got my attention, and apparently it got John's attention because he started the STERP team, and this was sort of the catalyst for the whole thing. But if that information is truly encoded in the shroud, in science, you know, you can't just use one test to prove anything. So you have to test it with other mechanisms. So this is a darkroom technique that we used to call edge enhancement, but my friend Aldo Goreski, the Italian photographer, calls photo relief. And it's a darkroom technique that basically extracts the same information, if it's there, from the photograph. And because the VP8 only had 8 levels of gray, that's vector processor 8-bit, so it was rather coarse image because it only had 8 grayscale. This is a photograph with virtually unlimited grayscale, and you can now clearly see the face, the arms crossed across the body, the torso, and even on the dorsal view, you can see the buttocks and the calves and the thighs, and it's clear as a bell, and this is a completely different technique for extracting the same information, and that shows us it's really there on the shroud. This is a part of the scientific method, is to do a different test to see if you get the same result. But we do live in a digital age. So this is Bryce digital software. They use it in Hollywood for animators use it to create topographical backgrounds in their animations, and it'll take and do a density stretch. In other words, take the lights and darks of the image, stretch them vertically proportionate to their lights and darks, and look what we get, another natural relief of the face. That information's truly there. We're not making it up, and nobody's fudging this. This is for real. This is encoded in the shroud's image, and that was the property that got me the most, because no artist, photographer, or hoaxer can do this. And look, over the last 35 years, I don't know how many efforts have been made by people to duplicate the shroud, often using my photographs as a reference, and they don't even come close to doing this. And they never capture this kind of information, and often their results look more like a cartoon than what we see, the refined image that we see of the man on the shroud. So, let's go back to our team. So for about 17, 18 months, we planned, we had meetings, we worked in small regional groups across the U.S. I was in the Santa Barbara group. That included the Brooks Institute guys, including me, and the guys from Jet Propulsion Labs. There was a group here in Colorado Springs. That was John and Eric and Ken and the others I may be missing. There was a group in Los Alamos, New Mexico, because a bunch of our guys were from Los Alamos National Labs and Sandia Labs, sister labs there. And there was an East Coast group as well, and a lot of our medical guys, Heller and Adler, were from the East Coast. So we worked in small regional groups, and remember when this was? This was the mid-70s. To communicate, there was no email. There weren't even faxes, okay? Now, some of the guys that worked at the national laboratories, they had teletypes, but us mere mortals didn't. So it was all by correspondence or telephone. That's how we did this. So maybe that's why it took us 17 or 18 months, but you'll see the thoroughness of our preparation during that time. But we never met together as a full team during that development period until a month before we were to go to Turin. And here you can see John, as a matter of fact, with Don Lynn. That's Don Lynn, the man with the glasses, standing next to John Jackson to the right of John. That's the guy who gave me the advice that kept me on the team. That was my hero from NASA. And you'll see that we built a special steel table because our whole goal was to be non-destructive. We could cause no harm to the cloth. So what did we do? We figured, well, a good way might be to fasten it to a steel table with magnets. No holes to be punched in it, no tape or anything that might be harmful to the cloth. Because we had a written agreement to do only non-destructive work. And of course, it was our wish not to harm the cloth that we were studying. So we decided we would fasten the shroud to this table with magnets, and because we were so careful, you know, magnets are metal, they might let a little piece of iron particles or something come off on the shroud. They coated all the magnets with Teflon, just to be safe. So now let's go to Turin. So we get on our airplane, we have, I don't know, 55, 60 crates of our equipment packaged up, put in wooden crates, send it over to Turin in advance. The night before we were to leave, we get the breaking news that Pope John Paul I died. Now we're in total shock. We don't know what impact that's going to have on our team, whether we're going to get permission or not. And we were all on the phone at midnight that night, and we already had the tickets and the hotels, and the equipment was already there. So we said, we're going, and we'll find out what happens when we get there, I guess. So we get on the airplane, we get to Turin. In the meantime, in Turin, the shroud is on public display for the first time since 1933. So 45 years it had been since it had been on public display. And it's kept here in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. In the five and a half weeks, I guess, it was on public display, 3.5 million people came by to see it, and I was blown away by that. Now, take a look. This, you can see, it looks like there's a pretty good crowd. Now, I'm sorry I can't get around to the front easily, but if you'll look in this one little area over here, you see that little building, looks like a bridge or something to the left. Let's look at that closer. Imagine standing in that line for 10 hours to get about a 2-minute look at the shroud, which is basically what they allowed. And I was baffled. I couldn't figure out what the heck would these people want to go see this piece of cloth. Some of these old people could barely stand, and they were infirm, and it just boggled my mind. I couldn't understand why people were so interested in a piece of cloth. So early one morning, where the shroud was on display, and this is inside the St. John the Baptist Cathedral where the shroud is both stored and displayed, you can see it in the center of the image there. And people were allowed to file in down the left side and stand before the shroud, and you can see it, perhaps you can see some people standing in front of it, down below it, and then they were ushered out to the right. So early one morning, I had already been in there a few times and seen the shroud, and I wasn't too excited about seeing it on display because I knew soon I would have access to it right there in front of me. But one morning I got up early because I didn't want to wait in a long line, and I probably did something very weird, which isn't that unusual for me anyway, but I went into the cathedral, and I got up front. Instead of standing and looking up at the shroud like everybody else, I turned around and I looked into the faces of those people looking up on the shroud. And I think that was the next time that God reached down and smacked me upside the head and said, hey, you better take this a little more seriously. This may not mean anything to you, but look in their faces. Look how important this is to them. So by the time I exited the cathedral that morning, my attitude had been changed. It's funny how God works, you know. He sneaks it up on you, you know. He just kind of sneaks it in there, and suddenly you've got this realization. So that morning, my attitude was changed. Not as good as it might be today, but way better than it was before that moment. This is the beautiful chapel, Guarini Chapel, where the shroud had been stored for about 350 years. You see that kind of in the center, there's that altar, and there's a green kind of grating, and behind that grating, locked with 3 different keys, was the reliquary in which the shroud was stored. Sadly, 1997, they had taken the shroud out of there, moved it into the cathedral to restore this chapel because pieces were starting to fall off the dome, putting people at risk. And they had just finished it in, I think it was April 97, and some arsonists came in and set a fire and completely gutted it. And the shroud was rescued out of the cathedral in a very famous piece of footage. A man named Mario Trematore rescued it. It was in a couple of, it was in its reliquary behind a couple of sheets of bulletproof glass. And nobody told Mario Trematore that a 9-pound hammer cannot break bulletproof glass. So he grabbed a 9-pound hammer, had his helmet and his jacket on, and he went running in there, and he broke through the bulletproof glass with his 9-pound hammer because nobody told him that was impossible, so he did it. And he rescued the shroud, and there's famous footage of him rushing the reliquary on his shoulder out the front door, rescuing the shroud. And, that's another attempt, apparently, to destroy the shroud. Here's a little-known fact. Turin is famous for one other thing besides the Shroud of Turin. It is the seat of devil worship in Western Europe. And there's a piazza in Turin that is considered the gateway to hell. So I told that to somebody, and they put up their hand and say, well, why would that be the case? And my answer is this. If you have an important relic of Christianity that's really important, you don't think the opposition's going to be there trying to put their hands on it? Of course they are. And in my mind, that's another piece of evidence of its authenticity. Why do they keep trying to destroy this thing? Think about that. Because if it were meaningless, if it were a fake, if it were a fraud, or as some people have even said to me, perhaps the devil is the one who made the shroud, then why would they be trying to destroy it? They'd be promoting it, wouldn't they? But they're not. There have been many efforts to destroy the shroud, and this is the reliquary. Sadly, they used to roll it up on a dowel, wrap it in that red silk, wrap it in that asbestos, really good, huh? Put it in this wooden box with silver on the outside, and put it up in that altar. Wrapping and unwrapping, rolling and unrolling a 2,000-year-old piece of cloth, not so good. The good news is, after the fire, they realized, first of all, this is a wooden box. Okay? If there's a fire, what's going to happen? That box is going to go, and so's the shroud. So they said, we've got to come up with a better idea. So they got rid of that old reliquary. It's in the museum, the Shroud Museum in Turin. You can see it. What they built instead was a very special $25 million box that keeps the shroud flat. It's behind bulletproof glass. It's in a nitrogen-argon atmosphere to keep it away from the kind of polluted air of Turin. It's humidity and temperature controlled by computers. It's light-tight except when it's on public display. And when they want to display it, you can see that box with the crucifix on it. They roll that out to the front of the cathedral, and they open it up, and they push a button, and the shroud comes out, still sealed, behind all that, and, protected. Then display public when they're done. They push the button, and it goes back in. They cover it up, and they seal it, and it is fireproof. And they roll it back into the niche here in the front of the cathedral. So that fire catalyzed them to do something to protect it and make it better. Yep, that's me. See, I used to have a lot of hair, and it used to be a lot darker. And what's really ironic about this photo now is I used to show this photo and go, look, the old camera and the new, the contrast of technology. And that's all nonsense today because these are both film cameras and they're equally obsolete, okay? His is a little bigger, mine's a little smaller. Neither one of them is very practical by today's standards because neither is digital. And both use film, and no, that's not USB. So we get to Turin, and we arrive there. Our team arrives, and we're, kind of disconcerted by the death of the Pope, not knowing what impact that'll have. But then we have another problem. Of those 55, 60 crates of equipment, one of them had an X-ray machine in it. And on the outside of that crate was a radiation sticker. And the Italian customs officials took one look at that and went, no! And they seized all of our equipment, wouldn't give it to us. Wouldn't release it. We were there a week early before the end of the public exhibition so that what we could do was get the equipment unpacked and calibrated and set up in the Royal Palace and be ready. So when they brought us the shroud, we'd be ready. So the first day goes by and we're all sitting around in meetings and the powers that be, you can ask John the details later, are trying to get the customs officials to let loose of our gear. And it took finally on the fifth day, we'd lost 5 days, and we were all getting on each other's nerves and ready to hit each other by then. Because we were tired of meetings. We were there to work and not sit around. And ultimately, a man named Peter Rinaldi, a Roman Catholic priest, born in Turin, altar boy at the Turin Cathedral in the 1930s when it was publicly displayed, became a Salesian priest, became one of the founders of the Holy Shroud Guild in the United States that promoted the shroud. One of those tracts that I read all came from the Holy Shroud Guild. Father Peter was born in Turin. He knew how things worked in Turin. So he said, I'll go and get the equipment. Now, while all this is going on, here I am with nothing to do but these stupid meetings. Sorry, John. Well, all these meetings, and it was very tedious. So I thought, being from Pittsburgh, I don't get much time in royal palaces. And I thought, well, while we're in the palace, because they allowed us in, not that we could do anything, we didn't have our equipment, so we were dusting and cleaning and stuff. And I thought, while I'm here, I'll make some photographs inside the palace, because how often do I get a chance to do that? So these are some of the photographs from that moment in history. This is the fresco. When you looked up in what we called the equipment maintenance room, I know that's kind of funny, but that's what we called it. It had been a bedroom for visiting royalty when the palace was being used as a palace instead of, it's now a museum, of course. And this is the fresco in the room in which we physically examine the shroud examination room. So I made these photographs, and then remember that fire I told you about in '97? I was able to present a set of these, because this is the area of the palace that was not destroyed by fire, but was damaged by water and smoke. And these frescoes are painted into plaster, so the water damaged them considerably. I was privileged in 1998 to present a set of these photographic prints of these frescoes to the Archbishop of Turin in hopes they might help in the restoration and getting it back to the way it used to be. So Father Peter Rinaldi goes down to the customs office and he asks to see the man in charge. And since he's a very tall, kind of resonant voiced priest, kind of an imposing guy, so he said, I want to see the man in charge. So the man in charge comes out and he goes, what's your name? And now the guy's a little leery. He goes, well, Father, why do you want to know my name? And he says, there's soon going to be an international incident, and I want to give you credit for it. And immediately the equipment was released as soon as Father Peter slipped him 100,000 lira, which, by the way, is about $80. Don't get excited. It's not a lot of money. Sounds like a lot. That's why the Italians were happy to go on the euro. But anyway, so Father Peter, knowing how things work in Turin, slipped the guy a little bribe, threatened him with an international incident. The equipment's immediately released and placed on a dump truck. That's a dump truck. So I'm making this photograph, and I promise you as I snap this photo, I'm thinking, any second the guy's going to pull the lever and just dump all our stuff out. This is the courtyard of the royal palace. Well, of course, somebody ran up to him and said, no, don't dump. And he goes, of course not. You unload. So we unloaded the truck and we moved all of our stuff into the royal palace. Now we've lost 5 days of the 7 days that we had anticipated for preparation. And this is the inside the royal palace. As you can see, we're bringing our stuff in and we get it unpacked and we're working around the clock day and night now. We're down to the wire. And this is the room in which we examine the shroud. You can see John sitting in front of the steel table, our exam table. If you look closely, that little guy peeking around his head around the opposite end of the table, that would be me. And this was one of the countless meetings we had over and over again. But at least we finally got our equipment. Now, this is another one of those, used to be a pretty cool photo. Now it's even funnier. I used to say, look at that modern equipment in front of that old 400-year-old tapestry. Except that whatever that modern equipment is, I'm sure that your iPhone has an app for that today. Because, this was the 70s. Integrated circuits and solid-state stuff was just coming into its own. We didn't have a whole lot of that. We were dealing with big stuff. Now, here's Vern Miller and Ernie Brooks unpacking some of the photographic gear. I'm sorry, going a little fast. And this is the equipment maintenance room. You knew that. Take a look at the hoses. Oh, notice the parquet wooden floors. And when you walked on them, they creaked and they groaned and they moved. And in 1978, they still had traffic routed in front of the palace, right next to the building. So every time a big truck or a bus went by, the whole building shook, dust came down. and the whole building. And, you know, that's not so good when you're doing long exposure photographs or x-rays or stuff like that. Notice the hoses, the garden hoses, running through the middle of the photograph. They're running through the equipment maintenance room, and at the far right back of the equipment maintenance room was the door into the exam room where we examine the shroud. Oh, why do we have these garden hoses? Well, one piece of equipment needed water. I guess it had a water jacket of some sort. Well, the problem was there was no water nearby. The nearest one, I'm standing in the doorway looking into the equipment maintenance room, and there's a hallway to my left, and way down at the end of that hall is a bathroom. So we had to get a bunch of garden hoses and string them all together and run them through and get them into the room so we could put water to that piece of equipment. Not what you expected, huh? Not exactly the laboratory setting one might hope for to do this kind of science. So remember those water hoses. They're going to come into the story again in a little while. This is the room in which we examine the shroud. You can see the steel table set up. We were doing infrared or thermal imaging, so we had to cover the windows. This is, on the right is Don Devan. That's the guy that got me involved. In the middle, Sam Pellicore, and on the left, Vern Miller. Sadly, both Don and Vern have passed away. But what are they doing here? They're setting up the photographic support system that allowed us to carefully measure the distance between the film plane, where the camera was, and the shroud on this long rail system. And then we could just slide the camera along, and the distance would remain the same. Now, that was brilliant thinking. This was before digital. 20 years later, when I took the 2 photographs I made of the shroud, put them into Photoshop to put them together into a single image, from which if you saw the replica yesterday, you saw it's made from that same image. When I went to put these in Photoshop and put them together, perfectly matched. I didn't have to work at all, because these guys thought to do this well in advance of us going to Turin. That's the kind of preparation that a real scientific team would do, and we were for real. So, anybody been to Italy? Okay, many of you have, so you know that in Italy, how can I put this diplomatically? Well, why be diplomatic? Let's just be honest. Nothing's ever on time in Italy. Okay? Because when we were there was a strike on the rails, so that the Rapido train was only 2 hours late. But the Rapido Espresso train was only 1 hour late, and they were very proud of that. So imagine our chagrin and surprise when, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours ahead of schedule, somebody yelled, "Here comes the shroud!" So I go running out into the hallway. That's the back door of the Guarini Chapel there that they just brought the shroud in through. They're bringing it down the hall to bring it through the equipment maintenance room into the room with where we would examine it. And I'm running out there, and boy, this is really going to be funny. I'm trying to attach my flash to the camera. Yeah, does that ring a bell to any of us old-timers? So I'm putting the flash on the camera. I have to turn it on, wait for it to power up, turning on the camera, and I make this one photograph of a very historic moment. This is the shroud being brought to us to examine it. And if you were to look real close, you'd see that the only thing in focus is the wall way at the end of the hall. Because, you know, I just didn't get the focus that good. But, you know, when you're capturing a historic moment, the focus is less important than capturing the moment, so it still makes it an interesting photograph, if not a technically superior one. So we get in there, and we're in there trying to get everything ready for the shroud, and it's already there, and we're way ahead of schedule to a point. Take a look at the table. The table had some corrosion on it. It was steel. But to show you how clever these guys were, we had a couple of NASA guys with us, and they brought with them a roll of gold foil mylar, the same stuff you've seen in the cargo bay of the space shuttle and on satellites. And they used it. The table was designed with removable panels, because for x-rays, you're doing x-rays as a shroud, you can't have a big piece of steel there. So the panels were removable. We had to cover those panels individually, because we didn't want any of the corrosion that we found on the metal to come off on the back of the shroud. Remember, everything non-destructive. But just think of the fact that they anticipated that as a possibility and brought the gold foil with them. It's expensive stuff. And notice that the two panels at the far end of our exam table there, which, by the way, rotates vertically or horizontally, you can see we hadn't even covered them yet, and already they're unveiling the shroud in front of us. Now, I'm laughing because I know the story behind this photograph. On the left are the Italian scientists. On the right are the American scientists. And they told us that if you touch the shroud, the carabinieri, the plainclothes policemen, who were guarding it, if you touch it, they'll shoot you. So I want you to notice that John and the other guys on the right have where their hands are. And notice the guys on the left could care less, and they're touching the shroud like it's, you know, just a piece of napkin or something. And I remember when I made this photograph, I was waiting for the gunfire. Because the guy on the left, Professor Gio, was touching the shroud. And of course, they were just having us on, or they just weren't thrilled to have us there, or all of the above. But the point is, I mean, these are not the kind of things that you anticipate when you go and you do something like this. But they lobbied to stop us literally to the moment the shroud was brought in the room. There were people there who didn't want us to do this for whatever their reason for. Now, there you go. There's the shroud. You can still see the steel table behind it. Still has a few uncovered panels. Now, look at the shroud and look at that white piece of wood that it's attached to. How do you think they fastened the shroud to that piece of wood? Well, if you heard Russ's talk, he might have mentioned it. Thumbtacks. And every place, so yeah, here we are with magnets and building a special table, and they just nail it to a piece of wood. They crucified it, if you think about it. And every place there was a thumbtack, they pulled it out, there was a little circle of rust with a hole of rust in the middle. Well, we've all seen that. And so we were just blown away. I certainly remember being shocked at this, considering all the effort we went through to be careful not to even leave a little dust on the cloth. And here they are sticking it to a piece of wood with thumbtacks. So here they are undoing the thumbtacks. And eventually the thumbtacks were removed. Our table was rotated horizontally, and the shroud was then slid off of the display board onto our table, where then it was ultimately, and you can see the plain piece of white painted wood, and there it is, fastened with magnets. And those magnets around the peripheral of the left side and top of the right side of the shroud, those are bar magnets, again, covered with Teflon to make sure that we left no dust or particles on the cloth itself. You also see some tags along the bottom and on the sides that were map coordinate tags that showed us so we could determine precise points on the cloth. Of course, since we were American, we couldn't go first. They wanted this guy to go first. His name's Max Frey. Max Frey was a Swiss criminalist, gathering evidence kind of guy, and he was the guy who initially one of the first people who came up with the idea of using sticky tape to remove debris from the clothing of crime scene victims. Pretty smart. But the Shroud of Turin, although it's sort of the clothing of a crime scene victim, the Shroud of Turin is a little more important than that. And what Max Frey didn't consider when he stopped off at his local dime store on the way to the palace to buy this cheap tape that he had was that the gum residue on that tape, when he stuck it onto the shroud and pressed it in with his thumb and peeled it off, would leave some of the sticky stuff on the shroud, which it did. We too had a tape experiment. Our chemist on our team from Los Alamos, Ray Rogers, contacted 3M, the real Scotch tape people, told them what we needed to do, told them we needed a tape that would leave no sticky residue on the surface of the cloth. And so they even not only designed that, they designed the mylar base of that tape to have specific optical properties that would allow them to do certain types of photomicroscopy right on the tape without having to, mess with that. Max Frey, on the other hand, didn't do that. So Max is doing his thing, and we're all watching, and I'm pretty appalled because look at the pressure that he's putting when he lifts this off. And then Max takes his dime store Scotch tape applicator and he walks over to the face of the man of the shroud, and he's doing this when John Jackson runs up to him and he physically pulls him away from the table. And if it looks like they're having a rather heated discussion, they are. And it was decided after this rather heated discussion that no one would put any tape anywhere on the face of the man of the shroud, which is the most iconic part of the image. He deserves all the credit. You'll get to talk to John after we're done here, so you can thank him personally for that. But these are the kind of things that, these are not what you expect when you're going to do a scientific project. You got to deal with all these personalities and stuff. Now, this is, on the man on the right, is Professor Giovanni Rigi. Really great guy. He had about 2 weeks' notice. We spent almost 2 years planning. He was given 2 weeks, and he had to come up with something to do before the Americans. An Italian had to go first. So Professor Rigi, being a clever guy, gets the idea that he will unstitch that backing sheet that the poor Claire sewed onto the back of the shroud in one area and insert an endoscopic camera or a vacuum nozzle, a special vacuum, and either vacuum some debris or look at the backside of the shroud. That's pretty brilliant. That's a really clever thing. So, and but it's simple and it's not expensive. So here they are separating the shroud from its backing cloth. Now I'm making this photo realizing that in a few seconds we're going to get the first look at the backside of the Shroud of Turin in 450 years. So I went running around to the other side of the table just in time to make what is probably the best known photograph I made in 1978. You've probably all seen this. That is literally the precise moment of the first look at the backside of the shroud in 450 years. That's Ray Rogers and John Jackson and Professor Rigi. So this is a very historic moment for what we did. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, I don't know if she took a vow of silence or just didn't want to talk to us. But I really felt bad for this woman, this nun, because I could see the fear and the stress in her face as she watched the Americans and these scientists all pulling and prodding the shroud. And I just felt so bad for her. And I looked over and I thought, I wonder what she's thinking. But I made this photograph. So I'm sharing that with you because there was a human thing that doesn't often carry through when you read about the science of the shroud. These are real people doing real people stuff. So those are her hands. She's removing a few fibers. Not for us, for the Italians. And there's Rigi and his assistant, Gabriele Parati, and they're about to separate the shroud from the backing cloth. They made a little brass bridge, is all I could call it, that will hold the cloths apart, so then it'd be easier to insert the endoscopic camera or the vacuum. And there's the vacuum system, and of course it's not the kind of vacuum you use at the house. It's a lab vacuum. And in the handpiece of this vacuum are sterile filters so that whatever debris he vacuumed up would stay within the filters. And he had a different filter for each area that he vacuumed. Problem was, when you vacuum between two cloths, whatever the loose debris is, you're not really certain where it came from. Did it come from the shroud? Did it come from the backing cloth? Was it trapped between the two cloths for some other reason? So not a whole lot came from the vacuum detritus that Professor Rigi got, but it was a very good idea. The better idea was the idea of using an endoscopic camera. Now, his endoscopic camera could see a circle 10 centimeters in diameter. So Rigi, realizing that, well, how am I going to know really what I'm looking at from underneath? Well, he said, I'll make a grid out of string. These are 10 centimeters square. So now he could lay that, and you can see in the middle, that's the famous epsilon or number 3 blood stain of the forehead. And when he turned on his focusing light and centered it underneath, now he knew exactly what he was looking at. Now think how clever and simple and brilliant that is. And when this moment occurred, when he passed that light through the cloth, we all looked and we learned something new at that moment that we hadn't yet been able to really know before. And what did we learn? We learned that the blood soaked into the cloth, adding density, and when light passed through there, that added density would show up as a darker area. Now, if in fact the shroud were a painting, as so many people say it is, if it were painted and we photographed the entire shroud with transmitted light, we should see the paint and we'd be done and we can go home and that's the end of it. So Eric Jumper, the cohort of John, the co-founder of our team, said to me at this moment, he said, Barry, before we're finished, we're going to find a time slot. You need to photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light, which a day or two later I did. So what do we see here? Well, take a look. You can see all the scorches and blood stains and burns and water stains. You can see the patches. You can see places that are unpatched where there are holes. What don't you see? You don't see the image, folks, because there was nothing added to the shroud to make the image. It's not a painting. And this was the first real hard evidence that we had that demonstrates that. Here's something to give you perspective. There's the shroud. All you see are all the things that did, in fact, add density. The blood naturally would, and the different densities in the scorched areas or the patched areas, but no image visible with transmitted light. So this was the first really kind of important thing that we may have learned among the many things that we learned about the shroud while we were there. Now, at this point, because of time, I'm going to zip through this next part pretty quick. Not only that, you don't really want me to talk about infrared reflectance spectroscopy, because if I start doing that, you will go to sleep. And my goal is to at least keep you awake until I'm finished. Then you can go to sleep if you'd like. So what I've done is I'm showing you the instruments, and I'm showing you the tests that those instruments perform. So I can give you an overview of some of the things that we brought with us and planned in advance that helped us create, in the scientific literature, the definitive, peer-reviewed database of knowledge of the shroud that exists. That was really the result of our work. There's that little X-ray, that little devil, the one that caused all the problem. And listen, that was just the beginning. Think about this. So you got all these X-rays you make of the shroud. That's not me beeping, I don't think. I hope it isn't. You got all these X-rays of the shroud. Now what are you going to do with them? You're going to bring them back through the airport? No. So we had to bring an X-ray processor with us and process them there. Because, you know, that way we'd be certain that the film wouldn't get damaged by X-ray machines at the airport. The only problem is, royal palaces don't have darkrooms. And you need a darkroom to process film. And there was only one place in the royal palace that was a viable place for processing film, and that was the only operating bathroom down that hallway where those hoses came from. Remember the hoses? So, when they needed to process X-ray film, what did they have to do? They have to come in the room with us where we were examining the shroud and say, anybody got to go to the bathroom? Better go now. We're going to make it into a dark room, just like you did with the kids before you went on a road trip. Better go to the bathroom. They were doing that while we were examining the shroud. Now, ultimately, they had to process them there. And this is actually one of the X-rays. You can see they were looking at one. And this was our technique. Our darkroom. Well, you know, you have to be flexible and use what you have available. So you can see that this this was not what you expected, was it? No. And this is what we were up against. So, you know, this was like an expedition into the unknown part of the jungle because we didn't know what to expect, but these guys were so smart. They anticipated just about every possibility, and we were prepared. And I'm very proud to have been at the bottom of that totem pole, but on that team. It's kind of funny that all these years later, the last two of us that are still out from that team, still out doing it, is John, the head of the team, and me, the guy at the bottom of the totem pole. Doesn't God work in funny ways, huh? Anyway, we also did microscopy of the shroud. This is Mark Evans using a wild photo macroscope, it's called. This is a close-up of one of the blood stains. Now, one of the things that kept me from accepting the shroud's authenticity was the fact that blood's still red. Old blood's supposed to turn black or brown. And so that really was a stumbling block for me. And it wasn't until 1995, 17 years after we finished our examination, that I was on the phone with Dr. Alan Adler, blood chemist on our team, expert, and I brought this up to Al. I said, gee, Al, you know, I got a problem. Blood's still red. Nobody's explained why it's still red. Al said to me, Barrie, you know, when I did the blood chemistry, I found a very high content of bilirubin, which is manufactured by the bloodstream, particularly with somebody who's tortured over a long period of time, given no water, goes into a couple of different kinds of shock. The body starts kicking out bilirubin into the bloodstream, and Al found a lot of high content of bilirubin in his blood samples of the shroud. So he said to me, Barrie, that's because of the way they tortured Jesus. That's sort of a direct forensic effect on his blood. So that was enough for me at that moment in time to accept that, and I had to believe Al because he was Jewish. I'm just testing you to see if you're awake. But no, he was the real expert on blood. And so that was sort of the thing that broke the camel's back for me, and in '95 I became convinced the shroud was authentic. It took me all that time. I didn't rush. Interestingly enough, I got a phone call shortly after I had that conversation with Al. I got a phone call from a friend who said, hey, Barrie, you know that shroud thing you're involved with? And I said, yeah, I know that shroud thing I'm involved with. He says, well, you know, it turns out that's nothing else but a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. I thought he was kidding. I mean, I laughed. I thought, oh, that's funny. because I'm not a great historian, but I know the shroud was being publicly displayed 100 years before Leonardo was born. He was a good artist, but he wasn't that good. And so I was a little taken aback by this, and I said to my friend, well, I realized he was being serious. I said, where did you get that information? And he said, well, you know, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. There it was on one of the tabloids. And I had an epiphany. It was then, that was another moment where God reached down and gave me a smack upside the head. Because at that moment in time, while I'm sitting at the desk having that conversation, there was a manila folder, and I wrote 4 words. Consider building a website. And that was God, in my opinion, saying, okay, you're getting there now, Barrie. Now I'm going to review. Why did it take 17 years for me to become convinced of the shroud's authenticity? Why didn't I think to ask Al Adler that question 17 years earlier? I've been asked that, and I have no idea, but then it came to me. I wasn't very humble when I was a young man, and God knew that. He knows what's in my heart, and He knew that I was not ready to get up and do this kind of thing because it would not be for the right reasons. So I had to wait until I had seasoned a bit, and God looked in my heart and said, okay, now you're ready. And then the idea of the website got placed in my brain. And that was in late 95, and on January 21st, 1996, Shroud.com went online. Somebody even said, how'd you get the name Shroud.com? It was available. It was easy, it was available. Yeah, there was nothing about the Shroud of Turin on the internet at that time. So, and now, you know, we're number 1 on all the search engines. Somebody made a big deal, said, Barrie, you know, you're number 1 on Google. I said, you know, we're 5 years older than Google. Because we are. But the website ultimately became my mechanism of not only preserving this, but making it available to all those people to whom this is important. Now, I'm going to run through a few more of these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, although I will show you this as a UV fluorescence photo, because remember that medieval forger you've all heard about that made this up, faked it up, as somebody once said? Well, this medieval forger was so clever that if you look at this, and this is an ultraviolet fluorescence photograph, color ultraviolet fluorescence photograph, that's the spear wound. Look at the spear wound, and now, take a look. Can you see the halo that surrounds that blood stain? It's very subtle, but you can see like a light halo that runs around the outer edge of that blood stain, which we saw in many of the blood stains of the shroud, by the way. That's only visible with UV fluorescence photography, folks. So that means that medieval forger said, well, I'm going to hide this there, and maybe in 500 or 600 years, somebody will invent a way of seeing it. And if you believe that, I got a bridge I can sell you in Brooklyn. I mean, this is the ludicrous stuff the skeptics want us to believe, that this isn't for real. That's my proof that I was there. Actually, you can see me with my 4x5 camera making the photographs. This was another one of my responsibilities. They asked me to be the documenting photographer. That was actually my formal and official role. And I had to document where each researcher took their data from. Well, since we already had magnets going to hold the shroud there, I got the idea to use magnetic markers. Little magnets, also coated in Teflon, by the way. And those little magnets were put in place by the researchers, and then I rephotographed them afterwards. Okay? And then I made a bunch of photos, and then when I came back from Turin, I had to take a big photograph of the shroud and project these smaller photographs of these magnetic test points onto the big one and use acetate overlays and go through all this pin registration because there were no computers. So it took me 3 months to make 8 maps that looked like this. I could do it in 2 days in Photoshop today, maybe a day and a half. But that was the limitation of what we did. But this paper was published in the IEEE journal. It's a set of maps, ventral dorsal, of I believe 4 or 5 of the experiments. Not every experiment, but most of the experiments. I told you that we also had our own tape. Ray Rogers, the man on the left, and Bob Dinner on the right, the 2 men responsible for this, not only did they go to 3M and make special tape up that wouldn't harm the cloth, they also designed a torque applicator that would allow them to control the amount of pressure they put on the shroud when they applied the tape, making it much safer for the shroud, so that when they peeled it off, they didn't do what you saw Max doing, peeling the shroud up like that. When Ray passed away, he actually left me his stuff, and I have that applicator. So that's a very fascinating thing. It is stainless steel, and it's a torque applicator. It's got a torque scale on it, and you can apply a certain amount of pressure like you do with a torque wrench when you're tightening the head on your automobile. And Ray also understood that if he stuck the tape down onto just glass slides, that whatever debris might have been picked up in the gum of the tape would get pressed deep into the gum. So he had special well slides built that are basically cut out so that only the very edges of the tape are touching, and the surface of the tape is about, a couple of millimeters off the surface of the glass or plex that he used. All this was thought of before we ever left. Every bit of this was planned in advance. And we had a computer. And you can see on the screen, that's what it did. Unfortunately, it didn't do anything else. I felt really bad for Bob Ewing, this guy. And what's really interesting, that's an IMSI 8080. Anybody know what that is? Well, first of all, it's a kit. He had to build this. Second of all, you see there's no keyboard. He had to have a separate terminal. And that red and black thing in the foreground, that is an 8-inch floppy disk. And no, that's not USB either, okay? And I felt terrible for Bob because it never worked, and it only did that, and he spent 5 days and nights just trying hard to do something. But I have to be honest with you. My wristwatch is more powerful than that computer. Speaking of which, that 8080 chip, you know those little stick-on clocks with the magnet on the back? You can put them on the fridge, and when the battery dies, throw it away and buy another one for 50 cents. That's an 8080 chip. That was what was in here. So, conclusions. Well, I'm just going to let you read this one. This is taken directly from the summary of the STURP's final report. Remember what we went there for? We went there to determine how the image was formed. And in a sense, we failed, because we can only come back and tell you what it's not. It's not a painting, not a photograph, not a score, it's not a rubbing. But we have no idea, at least at this moment in time, what mechanism can create an image with these chemical and physical properties, and every attempt made by every skeptic or even non-skeptics to duplicate that image, no one's even come close. Now, so I built this website, and I put it online, and I'm feeling pretty pleased that I finally figured out what to do with all the stuff I'd accumulated over those 20 years and all the photographs that I'd made. And I realized the best thing to do would be to get it out there where the public can have it, have access to it, free, no ads on Shroud.com. I paid for it for the first 14 years out of my own pocket. Now we're a nonprofit, so contributions help us now. But this is my respect for who this man is, because remember, he's one of our boys, too, okay? So it comes down to, what impact does this have on my life? Well, I put the website up, and within a year, I was getting a new question. People stopped asking me about the cloth because I'd put all the information up. They could find that on the web. The new question was, what do you believe? And they were not talking about the shroud anymore. They were asking me about my faith. Now, that's a whole different ballgame. I walked away from Judaism at age 13. I had my bar mitzvah. I didn't like the institutional things that I saw. I saw hypocrisy. That was probably the thing that bothered me the most. In large institutions, the older and larger they get, the more they have a tendency to fall away from the tenets upon which they're founded. So I walked away from Judaism, and I'm not excluding anybody, okay? I'm painting with the broadest brush possible, so I'm not pointing at any particular denomination. I'm just saying in general, that never connected for me. But I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. My parents were both born in Poland. My grandparents lived with us. It was sort of like Fiddler on the Roof, without the fiddle, okay? And being there, God was part of everything every day. So now I'm confronted at age 50 with the necessity of being honest and answering the questions people ask me. And that means if you're going to get public with the shroud like I have and John has, there can't be any questions that are off limits. If I said, oh, I'm sorry, that's too personal, then I would discard myself, okay? No, if you're going to get up there and talk about something this controversial, you have to be honest and you have to share whatever the question is. You have to answer it. So there I am, trying to figure out what do I believe. And I'm age 50, and God hadn't been a part of my life since I was a kid. I hadn't even thought about God. God was not a part of my life. Not even for a moment. Never even considered it. And now at age 50, I'm forced to confront this whole faith issue, and I have to be honest and I have to be public. So I sat myself down, and for the first time as an adult, I looked in my own heart. I mean, really looked in my own heart. And nobody was more surprised than I was to find God had been there all along, just waiting for me to acknowledge him. And when I looked, he was there. And how many Jews can say that their faith in God was restored by the Shroud of Turin? I can say that. Now, I know, because I'm not a Messianic Jew, I know that worries you. And look, when people come up to me and they express that to me, see, now when I was a young man, I would have been offended that you're getting your nose in my business. But no, now when that happens, I realize that person is expressing love. They want me to feel the love they feel in their heart. And by understanding that, by grasping that, I can do this. I can look you in the eye and I can answer your questions personally because my faith in God is strong. Now, I know that my faith in God is a little on a different path than yours, and I know that that gives you pause, if not great concern. So I'm going to tell you the same thing I told my Catholic audiences. I'm going to share a quick story with you. I was in a Catholic church, and a woman was very courageous at the end of this. She was a Filipino lady, I remember. And at the end of the Q&A, she puts up her hand, and she asked me the question that most people are afraid to ask, or at least she put it in terms that most people are afraid to ask. She said, "Mr. Schwortz, does that mean you've not accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior?" Now, that's about as direct as you can get, and that's the question a lot of people want to ask, but are hesitant. And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, I guess that's correct, that I haven't. She started to cry. So I started to cry. And pretty soon, there was tears in everybody's eyes. And I'm thinking, Barrie, you better do something. You're going to lose this audience. I don't want everybody walking out in, great sadness and tears. So I said, look, it's obvious. This was not my idea. God dragged me along, kicking and screaming all those years to keep me on that team. What, to make those photographs in '78? No, that was just the entree. But to bring this information to a broader public all these years later, to make it accessible to you. Look, there were 1 billion people on this planet who had far more right to be in that room than I did. But somehow God picked me to be in that room. Why? So I could bring it to you later on. And so, from my point of view, I think it's kind of funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger. I'm just a messenger. So it took me all those years to figure out what I'm supposed to do. And it's real simple. I'm just supposed to give you the information. Not to tell you what to believe, not to preach, not to evangelize, not my place. But I can look you all in the eye and tell you there is no doubt in my mind that this piece of cloth wrapped the body of Jesus of Nazareth. And whether or not he was the Messiah, as you believe, and I'm not sure, that's the honest answer. I don't know. Might be. So I'm going to tell you the same thing I told that little lady. Relax, I'm not dead yet. And when I said that to her, she laughed, and everybody stopped crying, and everybody got better because, especially in Catholic doctrine, you can make that decision right a split second at the end, and it's cool. And I know that's not what you'd want for me. I know that. But I had to do something because, I felt terrible because I sensed the love coming from that woman. And it was wonderful. And once I realized that when people confront me that way, they're not trying to get me to change something. They're trying to get me to feel the love that they feel. And that is a wonderful thing and a great compliment. I wouldn't consider myself worthy of that consideration. but people do, and that's a great gift from God. And let's face it, folks, I've had a long career. I've done a lot of stuff, Hollywood and L.A. and all that. All gone and forgotten means nothing, but this has become my legacy. My grandchildren's children will be able to look and find some traces of me after I'm gone, and that is a gift from God. So I'm going to end this by telling you what my Jewish mother, 90-year-old Jewish mother, said after hearing my first lecture about 8 years ago. She was born in Poland, emigrated at age 7 through Ellis Island, high school education, not an intellectual, not a well-educated person. And she heard one of my lectures, and I was in Pittsburgh, my hometown, and my friends there asked me if I'd do a lecture, and the archdiocese was very nice to give me a venue and put me in the newspaper and make it available. So we did. But of course, being a Jewish family, my brother, my mother, my cousins, and everybody else came to hear Barrie speak. And of course, I'm a little apprehensive because this is a bunch of Orthodox Jewish people. Now, when I say I'm not ultra-Orthodox, I want to be clear about that. There's a difference. So I give the talk. We get back in the car. We're going back to my mother's place, and she's silent. Beware a Jewish mother who's silent. Be afraid. She taught me well. So I said, Mother, so what do you think? And she said, well, of course, it's authentic. Boom! That was like a shock. I said, well, what makes you say that? Because I was curious why she would say that, having only heard one lecture. And she looked at me, and then she got Jewish mother on me. Barrie, in that condescending tone of voice Jewish mothers, any mother knows how to use. She said, Barrie, he wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it belonged to anybody else. Nobody'd care. Had to belong to Jesus. Why would they have kept it otherwise? And I laughed. I thought, wow, that's cute. But then as I reflected on what she said, I realized what a brilliant observation that really is. This is a burial shroud. What are we doing with a burial shroud? Where do they normally wind up? Around a body, decaying with the body in the tomb. We have a burial shroud of a dead man, absolutely no doubt, matching everything the Gospels tell us was done to Jesus. And it says in the Gospels he was separated from that cloth. They say 3 days, but folks, take a look at the real timeline. That's 3 Jewish days on the calendar, 36 hours. Friday evening, Sunday morning. No signs of corruption, as it says in the Gospels. There's no sign of liquefaction or decay of the man of the shroud. Don't you think it's amazing that we have a burial shroud? Now, why doesn't the Gospels tell us anything about this other than to mention it sort of in passing? Yes, there's burial shroud and the separate, the face cloth folded separate from the rest. How about the fact that it breaks 2 Jewish laws? It's got blood on it, supposed to be in the tomb, and it's got an image on it, a violation of Jewish law. In those first couple of centuries, the iconoclasts were looking for any kind of Christian relics to destroy them. And can you imagine if the disciples came running out of the tomb going, look what we found? They might have been the next ones on a cross, and the cloth would have been destroyed. So they had to keep this a secret. It had to be stashed away and hidden for a long time. And the first evidence we have that I've been able to find, I'm not a historian, this is not my art history, it's not my expertise, but the earliest depiction of Jesus that I've found in my studies is 285 AD in the Comitia catacombs of Rome. And it's Jesus with the split beard looking like the man of the shroud. And then there's a period of time again where he goes back to being depicted like a Roman emperor, bald with a little circlet. And then the 5th century, 6th century, we start seeing iconography. And then the Orthodox Church gets into iconography big time. And I'm not going to go into details because you can find that on shroud.com and in many books on the shroud. The point simply is, all the evidence points to the authenticity of the shroud. Except for one thing which we're not going to talk about during my talk because it would make my talk another hour, which you really don't want me to do, so I won't. All the evidence aside from the carbon dating, and there's a great dispute going on still in the world of the shroud about the carbon dating. So my standard of what I consider valid as far as the carbon dating goes, what's appeared in peer-reviewed scientific literature. I mean, you have to have some standard as a basis for what you want to accept or reject. And so because of the STIRP team always getting their work into peer-reviewed literature, making it valid and valuable and credible, my basis for belief is that the sample site that was chosen did not represent the main body of the shroud cloth. Why? Some people believe it was rewoven, perhaps, or repaired. Other people have other theories. There is no complete agreement on this. But effectively, there's peer-reviewed science, 2 peer-reviewed papers now, that point to the fact that the sample site chosen and the sample used was not representative of the main body of the shroud cloth. I will accept that because there's plenty of evidence showing the shroud is older than the dates they gave us. But with that, I don't want to go too much more time-wise. Final thought. Final thought. The Shroud of Turin did not come with a book of instructions. Oh, I backed that up. Here we go. Let me go to the last slide. The shroud didn't come with a book of instructions. The answer to faith will never be on a piece of cloth or any other object. The answer to faith is in the eye and the heart of those who look upon it. So the burden is not on a piece of cloth, but on you. And that's who I did this for. That's what I finally figured out, that I was in that room, not for me, but for you. Thank you very much.